you about the amazing new results from the MaNGA survey.
All right, thanks very much. So yeah, I want to give you a little bit of an update on MaNGA. MaNGA stands for Mapping Nearby Galaxies at Apache Point Observatory. So this is one of the 3 core programs in SDSS-4. And this is an exciting year for us because we just released our first year's worth of data and data cubes. So those are on the web and available for your use and enjoyment. And we're also really starting to work on our papers, and we have some exciting results that are coming out, some that have already come out and others that are due to come out very soon. So I want to give you an update on that. And I realize that this is a theory and simulation audience. So what I'm trying to do is kind of orient things more to what you might be interested in, and also connections between these kinds of observations and simulations that we might explore in the future. So first, let me motivate this talk. And is my microphone on? I'm not hearing. OK, great. So I want to motivate this kind of survey. So we're doing another spectroscopic survey. We're using the Sloan telescope. Why are we doing this all again? And one way to think of this is that previous spectroscopic surveys of galaxies, essentially treat them like a point source, right? You put your fiber or your slit across this galaxy, you add up all the light, you disperse it, and from that spectrum, you have this wealth of information, right? You learn about the composition of the stars and the gas, something about their internal dynamics, chemical abundance, perhaps evidence for an AGN, etc. So the spectra are really powerful. And in the case of surveys like Sloan or Deep 2, where you have enough galaxies, you can put this into context. So you can locate that galaxy in color magnitude diagram. You can compare metrics that you've learned from the spectrum, like its recent stellar age versus stellar mass. And you can begin to map out the properties of galaxies in your sample. And so this statistical power is really, really important. But it's important to remember that we're still considering galaxies as if they are point sources. And obviously they are not. They have a very complex and rich structure. And we really miss that when we put a fiber or a slit in one particular location of the galaxy. So you might even worry in the case of Sloan that often your fiber was just sampling the center of the galaxies in the sample. So perhaps what you thought you knew about the population is biased because you were just seeing the central regions. So of course what you would like to do is obtain spectra across the entire face of the galaxy. This is not a new idea. I refer to it as integral field spectroscopy or observations with an IFU, an integral field unit. The idea is just to get spectra everywhere. And what MaNGA is really doing that's unique is we figured out through new instrumentation a way of scaling up this type of observation to be able to obtain it from many galaxies simultaneously. So in the past, we only had handfuls or maybe 100 or 200 galaxies with this kind of information. We're now in the regime where we can achieve that for thousands of galaxies. And MaNGA is aiming to obtain 10,000 galaxies with resolved spectroscopy by the time we finish in a couple of years. So we've been driven by a set of questions that have set the constraints on the design and execution of the survey. These are basically how do galaxies form, but let's just go through them because they've been useful to us. So we're interested in the life cycle or the life history of galaxies, if you like. So questions like how does gas accretion drive their growth? What are the relative roles of stellar accretion, mergers, instabilities in forming galactic bulges, ellipticals, the round components? In what I call the death category, what quenches star formation? And how is that perhaps dependent on the environment in which the galaxies live? And even though this is a survey of local galaxies, these were all observed by Sloan 1, we're hoping to obtain clues about their earlier formation history. So how is angular momentum distributed among different components as the galaxy assembled and evolved? And how do those mass components separate? Can you decompose galaxies into their different components and figure out which ones are dominating? So let me just spend a slide or two giving you kind of an overview of the project. We have completed 2,700 unique galaxies so far. So we're on track to reach our goal of 10,000 by 2020. And as I mentioned, our first public data release was just a few weeks ago. The way that MaNGA works basically is we take the individual optical fibers of the BOSS spectrograph. So this was the previous survey that was running at the Sloan telescope. And we bundle those fibers together into arrays. And so we're making IFUs, and we can make multiple sets of them using technology that is shown here. So this is a cutaway of the ferrule, which holds the fibers together. And it's actually the machining, the careful machining of this interior diameter of the ferrule, the way it smoothly transitions from circular to hexagonal, which allows us to achieve very regularly configured sets of fibers as part of our IFU at the end of the day, and to do it cheaply. Right? That's important because we have many of these that we have to make and put into operation for our survey. The regular configuration is important because it allows you to dither the telescope and know that all of the IFUs are going to be properly sampling the galaxies in the same way. And so this allows us to generate a very regular and well understood data cubes, which you can now go out and play with. Maybe some of you are online downloading them as I speak. So let me tell you a little bit about the survey. As I mentioned, we're aiming for 10,000 galaxies. The spatial resolution is basically set by the seeing at the site. For our sample, that's about a kiloparsec or two. So this is not extremely high spatial resolution. The spectral resolution is also moderate, R of about 2,000 or 60 kilometers a second instrumental resolution. That's the sigma. The wavelength range, though, is very broad. So we go from 3,600 angstroms all the way out to a micron. And we achieve a target signal to noise by varying the exposure time, by obtaining the number of observations we need to reach this target of about 4 to 8 per angstrom in a single fiber in the outskirts of our galaxies. The sample is roughly volume limited above a mass of 10 to the 9, but it's designed in such a way to produce a final distribution that is roughly flat in stellar mass. So we're upweighting massive galaxies and downweighting low mass galaxies effectively. It's also balanced to an extent in color. So at the high mass end, we get more blue galaxies than you would naturally expect. At the low mass end, more red galaxies. And we can also balance the radial coverage. We can make it relatively uniform. So we reach both 1.5 effective radii and 2.5 effective radii for different subsets of the sample. If you'd like more information, there's this overview paper. Look for a paper by Rinbin Yan that's coming out soon that will tell you how the data quality look and that we're meeting a lot of the requirements that we set out. So as I mentioned, 2,700 galaxies observed. This is the largest IFU galaxy survey ever conducted. The public data release is out. Here's the website for it. And then in conjunction with the data release, we've planned a series of papers that we've been working on. We have about 12 papers. We call this part of our 2016 MaNGA Splash. And so the idea is that these papers are going to start rolling out in a couple of weeks, starting in September. So before I talk a little bit about them, let me just show you an example from one particular plate. So this is 17 galaxies, the number of galaxies we observed in one pointing. And this just gives you a sense of the rogues gallery of typical galaxies that we're observing. This is the first plate that we ever observed. Okay, so I want to highlight some of the science that's being done. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything, but I want to give a couple of highlights. And let me first mention that we already had our first 2 science papers using the survey data come out earlier this year. The first was by Francesco Belfiore. The second was by Edmund Chung, and Edmund was here earlier in the week, so I hope that you were able to see his talk. And in fact, Edmund's publication was in Nature, so we got to do a press release. This is the image for the press release of the red geyser concept that we think we discovered in the MaNGA data. And it was really fun to have these papers appear one day after another in May on the archive. And then we're excited that they were upvoted on the Vox Charta system over 100 times in combination. So that's a good sign for us. It seems that people are interested in some of the early results that are coming out. So let me just give you an overview of the splash and some of the themes that we're exploring. So what I've done here is put the first author of each of the splash papers that we're preparing up on the screen. And I'm noticing that we have kind of 4 different themes for the early work that's being done in the project. So we're studying ionized gas in galaxies, especially in early types. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Because of the large sample, we're now able to start probing environmental effects. So we're interested in how the internal structure that we can obtain, that we can study in the MaNGA data depends on the environment. And so we're starting to look into those questions. Obviously, we're interested in dynamical components, cases where you have counter-rotating stars and gas, or interesting dynamical signatures that you can study. And also then the star formation history and its dependence on position within the galaxy. Okay, so I want to just highlight a couple of topics, and then what I'm going to do is finish with something that's not on the list, but is something that I've been working on that I hope will connect with some of the simulators in the audience. So first, let me talk about ionized gas in galaxies. And this is a series of plots from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. I'm kind of picking on Kevin Shawinski here. I'm showing a kind of color magnitude diagram. So this is color versus velocity dispersion. And then the different colors here correspond to different categories of ionization given by the emission lines in the central fiber spectra of these objects. And the point is, if you have more star-forming-like emission line ratios, you tend to find those in the star-forming blue galaxies. And then as you move towards increasingly AGN-like or liner-like emission, you go into the red sequence. So this was interpreted as perhaps a transition. We're learning about how blue goes to red from how these AGN components are changing. But in recent years, in the last 5 to 10 years, it's become clear that what we were calling liners are probably not always AGN. So this is really, as a result of integral field studies, I would say, showing us that there's plenty of liner-like emission in the outskirts of galaxies that cannot be explained by a central AGN point source. So liners are more complicated, perhaps, than what we expected. I want to highlight work by Francesco Belfiore, who I think has taken this to the next level with the MaNGA data set. And he's developed a new way of classifying galaxies based on how this liner-like emission, these emission line ratios, are distributed spatially across galaxies. So this is just to go through it very quickly. Obviously, for star-forming galaxies, you find star-forming like line ratios. So here's the BPT diagram, and these colors are plotted over here spatially. You find star-forming line ratios everywhere. There's an interesting class where it's star-forming in the disk, but then in the outskirts, perhaps coming to Brandt's talk, we're seeing liner-like ratios, maybe indicative of winds and other features. But this is really an interesting new category. So here, these galaxies have central regions with these liner-like ratios, too big to be just AGN, but then as you get further out, you're starting to see star formation. And then finally, there's a category where it's liner-like everywhere, and there's another category not plotted where we don't detect emission lines anywhere at all. So we're beginning to see how these play out in terms of the population. Here's where they appear on the color magnitude diagram again. The central Lyre galaxies are in red, and you can see they're in the middle. They're in this kind of supposedly transition region between the blue cloud and the red sequence. So we don't exactly know what this means. Is this causal? Is this reflective of whatever mechanism is acting to shut down star formation and move galaxies through this sequence? We don't know, but it is interesting that they appear right here in this green valley. So I'd point you to Francesco's paper for a better, closer look at this, and something that we're going to be following up. So let me just spend one slide on gradients and environment, because I think this is something that people who are doing cosmological simulations can really help out with and maybe be interested in. So what we're doing is looking at gradients in stellar population parameters, so metallicity, age, and we're trying to see if those gradients change depending on the environment that the galaxy is living in. This is really our first look at the data. There's a lot of things we could do better, and the sample is still a bit small for this. But the take-home message is that we're finding almost no trend with environment. There's no significant trend in the gradients that we're seeing as yet in the environment where the galaxy lives. So you can see that this is a plot from Jung's paper. Here's the metallicity gradients as a function of local density. The different colors are different mass bins, and you can just see it's flat. What's the local density? We've done it in a couple of different ways. It doesn't really matter the statistic that you use. I mean, we're finding no trends, but Jung uses a complicated way of trying to identify alls, voids, filaments, clusters, and he's putting galaxies in that way. But if you do this with nearest neighbor, you see the same thing. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no signal here. It just means that it's subtle. And there's uncertainties both in the gradients and very large uncertainties in the environmental statistics that could wash out any signal. So that's the take-home message. We don't know exactly how strong of an impact those uncertainties are, those uncertainties would have. And so that's really where a simulation could be very useful in trying to model that and make sure that there isn't something hiding in here that we just can't see. But to first order, very weak or no environmental trends. Okay, I want to spend the last few slides talking about a project that is still in progress, and I'm really presenting this on behalf of a postdoc at IPMU, Dave Stark, who has been working with me and Matt Orr and Phil Hopkins down at Caltech. And we're interested in this question of what sets the conditions for the turning on of star formation in the outskirts of disk galaxies. So what is more important? Is it the self-shielding that comes first, the ability of dust to allow the gas to cool and then fragment and form stars, or is it instabilities that are more important and initially cause the gas to begin to collapse and then self-shield and then form stars? So this is a topic that Matt and Phil have been looking at in their fire simulations. And in some conversations with them, we realized there may be a way for us to start looking at the MaNGA data and also see what we could find out from the observations. So what we're going to be doing is using the turmeric Q parameter or a variant on it as a proxy for the fragmentation scenario and an optical depth to dust for the self-shielding. So what we're hoping to do is compare these two. Let me start by showing you the comparison that's coming out of Matt Orr's paper with Phil. So here we've got the optical depth and log Q. And here, this is not the standard Q, this is hot Q. So this is the Q that you would get if you assume that the gas was 10 to the 4 K. Okay, because we want to make it as hard as possible for the gas to collapse. And we don't want the dust to be cooling and then allowing the collapse. So what's plotted here are annuli from their simulated galaxies. And the point is that blue is non-star forming, red is star forming, and you see that when the points cross the Q threshold is when you start seeing this turn on in star formation as opposed to crossing the self-shielding threshold. So their takeaway is that the fragmentation is more important in the outskirts for turning on star formation than the self-shielding. Okay, so can we test this with MaNGA? And ideally you'd like to make the same plot, but it's quite difficult because there is a measurement that we don't have in order to form Q and to form tau, which essentially is the surface mass density of the gas. So the gas in the disk is just something that's very observationally difficult to come by, especially with the optical MaNGA data. So is there perhaps some way around this? Well, what we realized is that if we assume that we're really in the outer parts of disks, and so that the total surface mass density becomes dominated by the gas component, the stellar population is becoming subdominant, then sigma disk is basically sigma gas, and we can multiply these two together and get the parameter we can't measure to cancel out. So then we have something called Q tau, the product of Q and tau, and the question is whether that provides any information about these two different scenarios. And I want to show you that it does. Can you give me just a sense of the time?
We have about 2 or 3 minutes left.
Okay, that should be perfect. Okay, so let me just schematically show you how this works. So on the left-hand side, this is the scenario where tau sets the star formation threshold first. So we're coming from the outer part of the galaxy. This tau, the scale tau parameter, crosses the threshold first. That turns on star formation. And then only more interior does the hot Q parameter cross 1, and signifying that fragmentation would occur if the gas had not already been cooled because of the dust out here. In the second scenario, it's Q that matters more than tau for setting the star formation. The fragmentation happens first. So Q drops below 1, and then further more interior at smaller radii, the tau parameter goes above 1. So if we multiply these two together, you can just see schematically that as a function of radius, especially in the outskirts where we know star formation is occurring, we can actually tell the difference between these two using the product of Q times tau. So in the case where tau is more important, we expect to be seeing a Q tau product that is above 1. We don't necessarily know what's happening down here because we can't measure these individually, only their product. But in the case where it's fragmentation, we should be below 1 in the outskirts of the galaxies where the star formation is first occurring. So here's where the data actually fall. And what you can see in the MaNGA data is that we much more favor that second scenario where this product of Q and tau goes down and below 1 as you reach the outskirts of the galaxy. And this is, again, in favor of this fragmentation scenario and in support of what Phil and Matt were seeing in their simulations. So here, if I just take individual fire simulations, so these are individual galaxies, and then here is the kind of cloud of data points from MaNGA, you can see that they overlap pretty well. These are very low-mass galaxies that are in their simulation but not represented in the MaNGA data. Okay, so I think I'm done. Let me just summarize. So MaNGA has observed 2,700 unique galaxies. 1,400, basically the first year of observations, is now ready for your enjoyment online. And this is a big year for us. Not only do we have this data release, but we've been working really hard on some of the early science. I've tried to give you a small flavor of that. And I think there's a lot of interest in connecting more with theory and with simulations, and perhaps a lot that we can do by working together. So I hope to be able to talk to you all and get you excited. Thank you very much.
Questions? Let's have the next speaker get ready while we're taking questions. I'll go to Andra.
Okay, first of all, congratulations on the splash. Fantastic. My comment is about the last part of the talk, which is what I'm interested in. I would caution against basing strong conclusion on comparisons with Krumholz et al. Model, because that model is purposely simplistic. It makes a couple of very, very strong assumptions.
Just say again, which model?
Krumholz.
Okay.
Because, for example, it assumes that H1 to H2 transition happens in the regions of fixed properties, which correspond to CNM in the inner disk of the galaxy. Okay. In the outer disk of the galaxy, it may be completely different. And also, the transition depends on assumption about the clumping factor, which is tuned to reproduce particular observations, but may be different in the outer disk. Okay. So, it can be just inaccurate there.
Right. That's really good to know. Thank you.
Other questions, maybe? We had Eric, but we'll get Anatoly first. Anatoly.
How you would compare that with Khalifa? So now I've seen some talks done people from Khalifa, and they're saying they're much more extended. Most of your sample ends in 1.5 RE, right? Which it's your slide. We could go back to your slide. It says 1.5 RE.
I'll just tell you, it's 2/3 of the sample is 1.5, but
yes,
1/3
2/3. Okay.
But 1/3 is designed to reach 2.5. So, I think the major difference is the spatial resolution. So the Khalifa spatial resolution is higher than the MaNGA spatial resolution. The wavelength coverage is also a little bit different, but I think spatial resolution is the main factor, and then just the size of the sample is, as you know, 600 Khalifa galaxies. we have 2,700 observed, 1,400 released, and more coming.
So just a quick question about the metric you chose. So Q requires shear to limit star formation, otherwise you should be genes limited or something. So I guess the question is that, I mean, many of your galaxies are low mass, where they have solid body rotation curves and therefore no shear. So have you selected the sample to be differentially rotating to make that metric a useful one?
I haven't thought about that enough. I haven't thought about it. So let me think about it more. Maybe I can ask you. Yeah. No, we're basically using fits to the velocity field and getting omega from that. So it's perhaps not the right thing to do. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Kevin again. Yes, we have revolving chairs.
Okay, there was one that was in here.
I'm not musical.
This one?
It could be. Okay.
Yeah. Fine.
Okay, we are now moving on to Florence.